So kicking off, to answer this big question, what do we build next? We have James from B Corp and Tracy from FutureMate, and Bruce, look at that, perfect timing. Bruce from FutureX. So I'm not going to go through your bios because you know yourselves better than we do. But before we get into some deep exam questions, which the Virgin StartUp team have all been carving out for you, I wanted to just give you the opportunity, each of you, to share a little bit of the past. We're going to be talking about the future, but a little bit of past of how you've ended up doing what you do, and how it relates to this question we're asking tonight about what we build next. And Tracy, you were first in the room, and you also have an impressive bookshelf.
Thanks.
So we'll kick off with you, Tracy. Tell us a bit of your story.
Well, I went to university and did a philosophy degree. So what on earth was I going to do after that? But another master's in technology. So the funny thing is, kind of 30 years later, what I do is a combination of philosophy and technology. But in the interim, I joined an advertising agency and spent kind of 20-something years in advertising and marketing, working for clients like T-Mobile and BT, as well as agencies, and always found myself on the technology accounts, if you like. And so there was a point in time where I realized that actually, by the time you've uncovered an insight and you want to act on it, life's moved on, and businesses have moved on, and the market's moved on. So I got very much into foresight. And that's when I started my own company in strategic foresight and futures. And that was probably about 7 years ago. And so it's a combination of marketing, philosophy, technology, media has brought me to this place today.
So many fascinating things there. And just in terms of what does your day-to-day work look like? When you talk about strategic foresight, break that down for us. What are you doing? How are you helping people?
So it can be around helping departments in government or elsewhere create the right policy and feeding into regulations and the future of those. Or it can be helping startups or other businesses or global corporations. Obviously I've done work for Virgin, but also Google, EY, KPMG, Sky, Diageo, trying to tap into generational trends and other kinds of trends to bring those back into not just the marketing department, but innovation departments, and also try and help leadership teams, so boards, try and see and prepare for the future. That's the main thing I would say my job is about, is preparing. But yesterday,
no, go ahead. Yesterday,
I was just going to say, but yesterday I found myself on a Skype call with Audrey Tang, the Minister for Digital in Taiwan, which was an absolutely inspirational conversation. So I think with futures, it is what you make it. So every day is different.
Yeah, and I imagine this year's been a remarkable one for you, which I want to hear more about in a moment. But let's come to our other panel members. So James, tell us about your journey into B Corp and what you're doing there.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I didn't actually get the memo about the bookshelf virtual background. You didn't send it through to me.
You've got them all in your mind. You see, I just have them here to help me feel like I've got some knowledge.
Absolutely. No, thanks for that. And actually, as a fellow philosophy graduate, I'm terribly offended by Tracy's initial intro. But no, to be honest, I've always been really fascinated about business being more than it is right now, or than it has been in the last few decades. And so, I've spent a lot of time working with multinationals in sub-Saharan Africa, trying to kind of help them to create inclusive business models. So trying to integrate local businesses, so local SMEs, into their supply chains. So thinking about actually the impact that they can have on the communities in which they operate. Also, I've spent a bit of time working in girls and women's rights charity, again with large businesses on their kind of shared value business models, and seeing how we can create partnerships between the business sector and the charity sector, or the third sector more widely. And I guess there is some sort of through line now, because obviously I'm now working with B Lab UK on the B Corp movement, and just thinking about working with companies big and small in a completely different sectors, but all of the companies trying to become a model of stakeholder governance. And I'm happy to dig into what that means a little bit later on, but just a model of companies trying to use business as a force for good, and redefining actually what it means to be a successful business, which I think now more than ever is quite a prescient thing.
It really is. And just briefly, for those that are hearing the word B Corp and B Lab for the first time, what is it? What are you trying to achieve?
Yeah, sure. So B Corp, the B Corp movement, is a group of businesses around the world that are trying to put people, planet, and profit on the same footing. So you may have heard the likes of Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's in the UK, and then in the US. In the UK, more recently, we've had The Body Shop, Innocent, The Guardian, and very, very recently, Jamie Oliver Group join us. And part of it, at its core is really trying to measure and manage the impact of your business, but also kind of commit on a legal basis to thinking about all of your stakeholders and not just shareholders. So there is a systemic change kind of piece behind it, which again I'm happy to get into as the evening goes on.
Yeah, and there's a great, if you want an introduction to the most recent B Corp member, Jamie Oliver Group, Jamie's talking on the Channel 4 News podcast, Reasons to Change the World, and it's a really great introduction to that story. Big fan of B Corp, and I know there's B Corps in the room here or being represented. So welcome to those of you that are there, and those of you on that journey. It's an exciting one. Finally, Bruce, welcome to the Virgin StartUp stage.
Hello.
Good to have you with us. How have you ended up with us tonight? What's your summary of your story?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I suppose my story is that I got involved in entrepreneurship and startups straight out of high school. So I was in Scotland, and I was thinking, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? Posed that challenge as you're leaving school, and I thought that I'm not actually sure what I really want to do, but I loved this idea that I could create my own thing and kind of explore and test. But actually, from what I could see, there was very little kind of like people who are my age, my stage, who wanted to do this, and I didn't know where to go to look for help and support. So I decided that we wanted to create a company. We called it We Are the Future, and it was all around about inspiring and connecting entrepreneurs. And very quickly, people said to me, you need to get out of Scotland to see what the rest of the world looks like in terms of entrepreneurship and business and startups. And so that led me on this 5-year journey where we launched entrepreneurship programs between the UK and countries around the world and cities. So we went to Silicon Valley, we went to LA, we went to Chicago, which we actually partnered with Virgin Unite and Virgin Hotels to deliver. We went out to the Middle East, and it was fascinating seeing entrepreneurship in so many different ecosystems and communities, and seeing the kind of potential and power behind that. But it was actually in 2015 when we ran the event with Virgin in Chicago that the focus was all around people, planet, business for good. And it felt as though what was otherwise used to be seen as just kind of social enterprise was becoming much, much more mainstream. And people wanted to find a middle ground between kind of not-for-profit and the kind of more traditional idea of what a business is. And so we then co-founded FutureX in, I think, 2017, because we wanted to create this community that was going to usher in, what some people call the new economy, other people call it the purpose economy, whatever it might be. We really thought that all businesses need to be aware that they can be a force for good, and that the kind of ripple effect that businesses have can not just transform the way you build a company, but also it impacts your lives. And I think that's the kind of intersection that I really care about, is where does business meet society, society meets business, and this idea that they're separate things. I think increasingly they're becoming much, much more aligned. And I'm also just really passionate about helping people have impact at scale. I think that's been the kind of challenge in the past, is that lots of social businesses do incredible work very, very locally, and we can use the kind of tools of business startup to help people achieve impact at scale. So we're kind of best known for running big events, which used to be all about getting people together in real life, and has now pivoted to getting people together in the virtual world. And we've also got kind of an online community platform where we're trying to replicate all the stuff that you would get at an event in the cloud, I suppose. But really, it's about galvanizing this movement towards business as a force for good, but also recognizing that that's a virtuous cycle, and that helps the business grow. It helps you grow as a human as well.
Yeah, and that's so great to hear, that confidence in what you've learned. And it sounds to me, listening to your story, Bruce, that this is a 50-year career that you've built in the industry, not a 6-year one, or whatever stage you're at, with the wisdom that you've built, which is so it's great to hear from that. I guess in terms of where I'd love to dive in is like just real tangible examples of what the three of you are seeing, have seen recently or this year, of businesses and brands or organizations that you admire that are really like going about, whether the way they've adapted to the current pandemic crisis, or just going about their business or the way they're operating in a really in a way that you admire. So Tracy, you work with that sort of huge spectrum of different organizations. Who's catching your eye at the moment, and why?
I suppose the thing is, I have a belief that we're at a time where we really need to be quite ambitious now. It's not about being reticent or evolution. We are in the midst of a kind of quite big revolution of business and of other things. And so I think it's the time now to kind of really go for the new frontiers. And I think there's only 3 types of job in the future. There's jobs on Earth, there's jobs in space, and there's jobs in virtual reality. And that's it. And I've written about that before, and people have gone, "Oh, what are you talking about? Well, I can't understand jobs in virtual reality." But actually, this year, I think people have started to understand just how powerful a virtual platform and a virtual space is. And so I suppose some of the companies and business ideas that I've come across have been in the kind of telehealth, virtual healthcare, virtual meetings, and also even the kind of, virtual avatar, virtual being kind of world. And I'm quite obsessed with that at the moment, because what I'm seeing is a whole host of completely new, groundbreaking businesses that are almost using virtuality to build their businesses and test them out, and then later they might take them into the physical world. One in particular, I think, that's been impressive is there's a little company called Deep, which is virtual mental health awareness and training, if you like. And so they build these virtual apps, and you can go through a quite, you put on you put on the visor, and you put on a belt. It's using your biometric feedback to track how anxious you're getting in a certain virtual scenario, and you can set those up, of course. And they use systems like that to train the police, for example, in quite traumatic and difficult situations. But you can use that as an everyday person to try and cope with anxiety, so that when you go out in the real world, you have actually it's kind of an operant learning. You've taught yourself something through a virtual world that you can then take out into the physical world. So there are things like that that I think are really kind of interesting and will be groundbreaking in the future.
It's like that picture I saw of the cow with the virtual reality headset on, that was sort of just projecting, beautiful fields, and they're sort of very calm at the place they like to be, rather than being in a shed. And as a result, the quality of the milk improved. And it's like, okay, who's going to...
I don't know if we want the cow's biofeedback.
Well, exactly. It's like, how far does this go? And then Elon put a chip in a pig this week, didn't he? Which is another...
Yes, Gertrude. Poor
Gertrude. Poor Gertrude. Can I just dig in briefly? I know it's so hard to do this briefly, Tracy, but like, why the revolution for those only three types of jobs, or in the future? Why is that happening now? Is it the combination of economics, pandemic, environmental crises? What's forcing out technology? What's forcing us to this point? Which I know is probably a book of an answer, but
yeah, don't worry, I'll be brief. It's that, but it's because of it's just really the cycles of history, and over time, and we're at the end of an 80 sort of year cycle where there's always a big disruption, which either kind of could go into collapse or could go into kind of a dynamic revolution and end up in a better space. And what's happened is that we've really now come to the crunch of 2 systems clashing. The old institutional, hierarchical, organizational structures we had, which lent on planning, post-war period, if you like, all the way through to now,
Yeah.
and the new networked, decentralized, flat, unhierarchical structures that most of the new companies over the last 20 years have been built on, and those two things are clashing now.
Yeah.
And there's going to have to be a winner, and that's why it's a disruption.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's really helpful to think about what we build, and it reminds me of Rachel Botsman's book, Who Do We Trust, and like how the evolution of trust is being decentralized. There we go. It's on the shelf. James, coming to the B Corp, you have about 500 examples here, I guess. But what's on your radar in terms of real trends about who you think is thriving in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to take kind of two different examples from probably two ends of the scale, maybe even two ends of the sexiness scale, and you'll understand why. So the first is a B Corp, and I'm not legally obliged to have to give that example, but one of my favorite examples is Elvis and Cressy, who some of you may know. So this is really an example of a company that even way before the crisis, way before the idea of the climate crisis was really put right into the mainstream by people like Extinction Rebellion and other kind of popular movements. She kind of saw this waste, basically saw the idea that basically all of these kind of fire hoses, a relatively kind of strange, benign waste product, were going to landfill. And so she thought, okay, what can I actually do with these? They're strong, they're durable. And originally she tried to make household tiles from them, like roofing tiles. That didn't work, but she's now pivoted, and she actually sells very, very kind of high-end looking handbags and does, enormously successful doing so. And so she said something really, really interesting at our conference last year, which was, if you create something that is then, has a life cycle of 2 months, 3 months, a year even, and it goes to landfill, you're not a creative, you're a destroyer. And she has this really interesting kind of approach to being a creative, that, you're far more creative when you have challenges and barriers, and, you have to actually commit to not polluting and treating people properly. And so I think that's just a business that's always been such an inspiration to me. And on the other side of things, I think, even today, and this is, a completely unsexy business, cobbling and key cutting, Timpsons, in terms of a company that just every moment does the right thing. And it's not about their business model, it's not about the product that they make. It's just about treating people right.
Yeah.
And I saw today that the CEO basically said on Twitter, if our stores are a bit short-staffed today, that's because we give every parent a day off when it's their kid's first day of school. And that kind of thing is just, you can imagine as a worker what that would feel like for you to actually be given that. And so two ends of the scale, but two fascinating businesses, I think, and two examples of different ways to create different kinds of impact.
And what strikes me about those examples, James, is that it's both about the leadership rather than the business. Okay, the business model is important, but it's the type of leadership that there's always been at the front of those businesses. It means that they have the reputation that whatever happens in the world, they will adapt and their brand will continue to succeed, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something that really kind of puts them apart. And I think it's that very strong commitment as well. It's kind of like, companies, they're not always going to do the right thing. No one is a perfect company. But as long as you have the commitment to continuous improvement and actually committing to acting in a certain way, that's really going to take you a long way. And I think that's what's guided those two leaders to making the decisions that they make day in, day out.
Definitely. And that's the beauty of starting up, because you can make that decision on day one with your partner and just get on with it. So Bruce, in the FutureX world and ecosystem, what are you seeing? What's exciting?
Yeah, so I think that like Tracy and James have mentioned, is that there are a variety of ways in which to do good now as a business. And I think that we're seeing that people can do that at all different stages. And I absolutely believe that it's not just about what you do, but it's about how you do it. So that point of, if you've got a philosophy where you look after your people, then that ends up being a much, much more sustainable model, because you're constantly looking after the kind of human capacity side of it. So I think from from a big company perspective, this year we saw most brands actually this year tried to respond in some way to COVID and offering services. What's interesting is how many of those do that over the long term and how much of it was a kind of short-term reactionary thing. But what we're seeing is, everyone from people like Brewdog this week or last week announced that they're going carbon negative. They're very much looking at not just about what they produce in their distilleries, but what does their whole supply chain look like. And I think that kind of big action is excellent, but it's also about recognizing that it's not just doing one thing, it's continuously changing and adapting. But then all the way through to lots of really small businesses who have just made an emphasis during this period to look after their people, whether that's being extra flexible, very considerate of the kind of human patterns that we're going through, the waves of energy and then depletion over the last few months, all the way to those businesses that are actually leading with their kind of purpose. So there's a company in our community, Pawprint, which is all around using behavioral change to help people reduce their carbon footprint. So gamifying everyday behaviors and tasks in order for us all to consider, what impact we have. And then we've also got people who are using technology to match people with services that they otherwise would find it really difficult to get access during this time, whether that's care for the elderly, which is actually an area which has been had very little innovation, and there's lots of people looking at aging population and how we use business to support us as we all get older. So I think there's not a monopoly on kind of the future of business, but what we're seeing consistently is people prioritizing people, planet, and sustainability. And sustainability is not just about environmental sustainability, but thinking about is hyper growth, and it's a kind of win-lose scenario. Is that the most sensible model? And whose model is that? And is that actually the model that most founders want to follow? Or is that being guided because that's the kind of usual paradigm that benefits typically those that are funding it? That's a model that works for them. And I think what we're starting to see is that there are multiple ways to scale and grow your company, but the most effective way is to focus relentlessly on your people. And actually, you can speak cynically about why that's good for business, and there's endless stats on that. But if you're just honest and say, like, how would I like to be treated? How would I like my parents to be treated, or my brother, or my whoever to be treated? I think when we start asking ourselves those questions, then we create much, much better environments, and that's what keeps people going, particularly during what's been a very, very challenging year for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. I love that Brewdog campaign. FUCO2. They're just bold and rude, but they get the attention, and they're backing it up with their action, which is what's great. So we can all get excited about this, and I've been excited about this for 20 years. And the B Corp is just like encapsulated as sort of what the social enterprise movement was maybe struggling to put, measure accurately in different ways. But the challenge, I think, for knowing a lot of Virgin StartUp founders and other founders who are saying, "Oh, I've got this real strong why, and I can moving to this future, and I want to solve this problem in the world." But then it comes down to like, well, hold on, we haven't got the resources. We haven't even got people to treat well, because it's just me and my friend or whoever it is, and a small Virgin StartUp loan. So how do we compete with like these big companies that may be greenwashing or purpose washing, whatever we want to say? Like, how do we say, okay, we're going to solve a problem in the world or on another planet or in virtual reality, and this is what's going to set us apart and get us up and running. How do we help individuals get going? I'll throw that out to whoever wants to have a crack at it.
I think that the first thing is to be true to yourself. So authenticity is the number one. I think for anyone who's starting, whether you're on your own or you've got a few people, is that being authentic about what you believe and sticking to that. So it's like communication. It's how you talk about issues. It's how you talk to your customers. It's how you genuinely feel about your customers. I think that's all part of it, because we're very much aware, all of us, I think, increasingly, of greenwashing, purpose washing, and brands that are inauthentic. And I think we need to be much more cognizant of like all the decisions we make as a business, and then how we communicate that back. Because there's lots of really amazing startups out there who are doing good things every day, but they're not telling anybody about it because they're not getting into the habit of sharing that kind of success and the positive stories.
So they're the opposite of greenwashing.
Yeah, I think so. It's sometimes a bit too humble and feel like they've not achieved enough yet to share that story. Yeah. But I think that we build loyalty and trust by telling people when things are going well and when things are going badly. And that's how we start to build up much more transparency and trust. And for me, that's a big part about being a purpose-driven company. It's not just about what you do. It's how you behave, how you hold yourself accountable to the decisions that you make.
And you see that a lot in the B Corp community, James?
Yeah, I do. And to be honest, we have a lot of startups that we call kind of companies that are under 12 months of operation. They're called pending B Corps. And what we really do with them is that we talk about governance, which is really, what everyone wants to talk about all the time. So what those companies do is they actually they make a change to their articles of association. So they actually change their legal structure to reflect their values, which you can do. There's no divine kind of way in which you have to kind of have your articles or your governance documents as a company. So they actually change that to say, we want to consider all of our stakeholders in our decision making, and not just our shareholders. And it kind of, because you have so much control as a founder from the start, right early on, it actually kind of sets your pathway forward. You've kind of made the decision and you've locked yourself into it and said, well, that's how I'm going to run my business, and this is going to give me the chance to make good decisions going forward. Because, without getting too much into it, I think there's a lot of good people out there in businesses making bad decisions because of the system in which they find themselves. And the other part of it is really just echoing Bruce's point. You might not have employees, but you have stakeholders. You have suppliers, you have customers, you have the community or the environment. And actually getting to know them and building a relationship is where this idea of resilience comes from. And so, when we hear, when Tracy talks about what's to come, and it sounds like really uncertain, and there's a lot of kind of, it seems like there's going to be a lot of change. It's that resilience that has kind of put your business in the right kind of space for that. You've created that muscle to have conversations with your suppliers and your employees and your customers, and they're going to be loyal, engaged, and motivated to kind of stand with you and be a partner, not just a transactional kind of relationship.
Yeah, so resilience as well as Excel forecasting skills is a crucial skill. And Tracy, so I feel like reflecting back on your early comment, like we're at the end of an 80-year cycle. It's either all going to fall apart, or it's all going to be another renaissance, an exciting moment in history. And I'm sitting here with my little idea and my sort of like £5,000 loan, and but with a lot of idealism. This feels like maybe it's not the right time. There's too much change. Like why should I even bother trying to start something?
Because now is exactly the right time. I mean, even practically, the cost of labour will be low. There'll be some really experienced, great people looking for new opportunities. The thing about change is it always brings more change. So the disruption we've seen with the pandemic, a virus, then brought more change to the economy, which then brought more change to the education system. And everything will change to some degree. And I think for people who have got a little idea, especially if it's an idea that's come from a pain point or a bugbear of their own, or some product or service they couldn't get any other way. And you mentioned sort of big corporates or big tech companies earlier, they've got all the resources, all the cash reserves, all the greatest talents. How can you compete? But you can compete with a really, really good idea. I think sometimes if you are a small business, and I run a small business, sometimes the best thing to do is collaborate with other people. So I mentioned about it being a network society earlier. That's great because it means you can reach out to potential partners, collaborators, and if you haven't got everything you need yourself, which you hardly ever have, then you find the like-minded, like purposeful sort of other companies or partners, and and work with them to create what you want to create. But I absolutely think now, in the next 12 months, is exactly the right time to take the bull by the horns and see the opportunity in this, what kind of looks a bit chaotic and complex and uncertain. That's good. That's good for starting a new business.
Fantastic. I feel like I've been told. It's great. I'm on your side. I'm on your side, but we all have our moments of doubt. So it's really great to hear that. The business models, the sexy business model question. When it comes to building things with purpose, there's always this assumption, or not always, but I think there's often this assumption that it's going to cost more. Therefore, our margin is going to be less. Therefore, this isn't a way to build something that's really strong and commercial. I think the social enterprise community, certainly in the UK, has suffered with this sort of like cloud hanging over them. It's like, oh, how much is good profit? How much profit should I make without it being right or wrong? And, ends up going around in circles rather than going out into the world and trying to conquer it. So from what you're seeing and from what you've learned, does the type of business model matter? And if you're someone that's like, I'm trying to solve a really difficult structural problem in society, can you have a kind of high margin aggressive business model, or is there an ethical conflict there?
I mean, sorry, I was just going to dive in.
Go for it, James. Yeah.
So I think fundamentally, I think sometimes people get caught up in the business model and thinking, if I want to create a purposeful business, I have to create this elaborate business model that is a completely circular thing that's kind of going to make everyone sit up and take notice and be surprised at exactly what I've done with my big, powerful brain. But actually, you don't have to do that. You can run a completely, normal product and service business, but just do it in a purposeful manner. And the way in which you do that is at its core just caring about your stakeholders. And again, it goes back to what Bruce is saying. If you commit to building and improving your relationship with employees, suppliers, customers, etc., that is really all there is to it, because you're engaging them in conversation and you're learning actually how they experience the business. And the idea of a stakeholder is someone that is affected by or affects your business, and therefore it is affected by your business, so they should be experiencing it well, but they have a massive impact on the operations and the success of your business. And so fundamentally, I would say there's so many things that you do without even really looking at your business model. But then just to touch on the business model, there are a number of kind of companies in the B Corp community that are doing really interesting stuff around products. So, if you're creating a product, can you look at your inputs and see if they are the output of any other process? We have a company, EcoBooth, that does kind of recycled materials for the events business. Obviously, the events business is a bit tricky now, but it did in the past produce a lot of waste. And I think they created an event booth out of 500,000 plastic straws and that kind of thing. And it's not just that you then have a great business model that is doing well, but the story that you can then tell with that. And again, back to Bruce's point about don't forget to tell the story is really amazing, because you can go and talk to your clients and say, this is actually something of interest. This isn't like, we are an events company, we can do this for you. It's something so much more that you can play with. And so, yeah, I would say the business model, fantastic if you can do it and if you want to do it, but there are so many other options within the just simple day-to-day running of your business.
Great, but presumably not to be shy about having a profitable model. I know this sounds obvious, maybe, but I think to a lot of people who are they're like, well, I'm trying to solve this problem in society, I can't make money from it. There's that sort of conflict.
I mean, I would ultimately say, just quickly, it's almost the purest kind of entrepreneur there is. You've taken an intractable social and political problem, social and environmental problem that, maybe politicians haven't been able to fix, the government hasn't been able to fix, civil society hasn't been able to fix. And you've not only fixed that with, you've fixed that through your business model, but you've made a profitable way of doing it. Stand back and applaud. That's the real win for any entrepreneur, surely.
Yeah. Bruce.
And I think that's the thing is that it's like, it's a journey. So it's not about having to achieve all your kind of sustainability goals on day one either. So I think that for so many businesses, to get a business model that fits your customers and your model is hard enough. So I think that you need to build something that makes it sustainable for you to be able to grow. And that's certainly our perspective at FutureX, is that we want to help people achieve impact at scale. And so a really regenerative business model that helps them grow is really important. And I think that if you get to the point where you're making so much money, then you can very much think about, well, how do we reinvest that money in? And I think that that's the other side of it, is it's thinking about business as a value add rather than a value extractor. And I think that, we shouldn't forget that even though there is this like movement in both the startup and the corporate world, is so many people are just not doing it particularly well at the moment. And so, you even taking those first small steps is significant. And I think that if we encourage more people to take steps on that journey, then that's definitely a positive. I hope that, if people were making so much money that they pay their staff higher wages, they provide them more flexibility, they reinvest into their communities, and they become an essential part of that local or national or international economy. Because they're continually reinvesting. I think that then we've got a really exciting position where we've got social businesses that are profitable, which is really important also for the economics of how our country works. And I think that's the other thing we can't forget, is that that's how we generate money as a nation, as well as the businesses who employ people, they pay tax, businesses then pay tax. And that's what funds all our kind of social services and all the rest of it. So we should want businesses to be successful, but they shouldn't be causing harm as they grow. And I think that that's the significant point, is to continue, as you grow, continually reevaluate, are we causing harm? And if so, how do we reduce that and actively, contribute more positively?
Yeah, and take responsibility for those externalities. And we go back to Patagonia as that kind of like great example, made money and is now, and it's been an activist organization for 40 years. Tracy, so we're a room full of 150 entrepreneurs, founders, creatives here. What should we be building next? What in terms of the trends? I mean, Harari talks about, we live in the age of bewilderment, right? We're all a little bit like, some days we're excited, other days we're a little hazy right now. If you were going to start building something yourself, or you're seeing like, here's really interesting, like the future of this, what are you excited about? What would you share?
Okay, so anything that puts a media layer over an existing category or industry or business type, anything that can put a virtual reality or an augmented reality, mixed reality layer over, any kinds of business that is about digital modeling that will help us understand the real world before we have to make the changes in the real world. So there's a great startup, I'm sure everybody knows, called Improbable. It's quite big now. It's had some quite a big investment, but started building games on a kind of distributed operating system. Now you can simulate all sorts of other things, because people are moving around and changing now. We have to think about, maybe cities aren't going to operate, and urban environments aren't going to operate in quite the way they did, and people have left some of those environments, and they're moving out to more rural places, not just suburbia but more rural. And so what kind of products and services would they like if they're not going to be commuting on a kind of at 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock? What kind of life are they going to be living? What are they going to need? I definitely think education is massively ripe for disruption. I was just looking at some stats yesterday. Twice as many people in America are considering homeschooling their children from now on than they were before. So thinking about those pods or hubs and how you can educate children in a more individual way to bring out some of their talents and skills and actually hone what they're already interested in, rather than getting them to learn by rote and memorize facts. How can they be creative and think about their passions and their interests? Actually, that is one of the interesting things they've done in Taiwan. It's not, kids that are about 7 and 8 years old. It's about trying to really understand what they feel their purpose or mission might be. And I think if you teach kids that early, then they're probably more likely to go on and build a business of their own, which is purposeful and is in line with their own mission. And to Bruce's point earlier, kind of taps into their own authenticity. So I think education's really ripe for change. So anywhere where you're seeing a little chink where there's a need that's not going to be met in the future, or you can see the new trends kind of don't fit quite right, it's an entrepreneurial opportunity for anybody.
Yeah, and crises are right for those. B Corp Utrecht communities, what trends are you guys seeing?
There's definitely a trend in terms of sustainability. So I think that everyone is thinking about how they create a more sustainable version of what exists currently. I think that's a massive trend at the moment. And as Tracy mentioned as well, education is I think particularly this year, it's been on that trend for a long time, but particularly this year it's accelerated so much. And people are just asking if the current model's fit for purpose, and thinking about how do we, rather than a one-to-many, how do we kind of personalize that experience much more. And I think that we're seeing more of that across the board. A kind of personal experience is becoming more and more of a thing, which poses challenges as well, as we know, as we live in, potentially we're meant to live in a more interconnected world, but potentially we live in just silos within that kind of interconnection. So I think that those are interesting considerations, as well as how do you convey, as technology becomes more prevalent, how do we focus on the kind of human aspect of it and the value it actually adds to us as people? I think that's really significant of generally about all businesses making much more of a focus on how technology enables things. So those are probably the areas of big trend. And aging population is also a massive thing. I think that you certainly can't be, you're certainly not in the wrong place if you're looking at how do you support the kind of transition for people moving to elderly care. And there's lots of stuff, particularly in Asia, that is doing some really interesting things that we should be thinking about, as well as we accelerate fast towards that. What does the world look like as we live longer? And how do we sustain ourselves? How do we stay interested and active when the chances are we'll be working and living for much, much longer?
Yeah, and because the majority of entrepreneurs under 50, they don't think about the aging population as much. So it's a big world of opportunity. And James, what about in the wonderful B Corp community? And maybe just explain briefly, because we haven't had a chance yet, how it works, how you can become a B Corp. What are the trends there?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big things that we're seeing is just a kind of an exponential growth in demand, which speaks obviously to Bruce's point about the trend around sustainable business growing, which is fantastic. I mean, it's grown over the last 12 to 18 months, but actually since COVID hit, all of our indicators of engagement have like doubled, which actually feels like a bit of a step change. It feels like, if you remember back in 2008, you had the financial crisis, smaller in scale. It felt like CSR was at the end of the balance sheet. They got guillotined as soon as someone started cutting costs. But actually now, it really feels as though companies are engaging with sustainability as a way to navigate through this crisis. And that's when we're starting to talk about resilience and that kind of thing. And so in terms of kind of how this relates to the B Corp community, so there are kind of two kind of conditions for becoming a B Corp. The first is the performance requirement. So going online and using the B Impact assessment, which is completely free, to measure and manage your impact across all of your stakeholders. And the second thing is the legal change that we talked about. So actually entrenching your values into the governing documents of your company. And so it's those two things that are really critical to joining in with that group. But wider than being just kind of a certification or a community, it is actually, what we're trying to do is take this trend towards operating more sustainably and ride it towards systems change. So, it's not just kind of an audit that we're trying to do. We are trying to move from a system in which shareholder maximization is the one and only kind of governing ideal for a business, to one of a more stakeholder governance model. And actually all of these kind of conversations about the onset of technology. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for our employees? What does that mean for our customers? They are a lot less scary through the lens of a stakeholder governance kind of oriented business. They are a lot more scary with a kind of a company that operates on a shareholder maximization model. And it's really interesting that we're talking now, which is exactly 50 years after Milton Friedman wrote his famous letter, which was saying that the business of business is business, and that's it. And I think we are coming out of that decade, that half decade, and coming up with a slightly more enlightened idea of what a business can do.
Talking of 50 years business experience, Andy just told me there's a special guest that's wants to join us on stage, who might have a couple more questions or thoughts to add to this. So Andy, if you can add our guest in, and then we've got about 10 more minutes of conversation together, and then we're going to break out into lots of different sessions. So 150 of you that are here, I'll let you know about that. Let's just see if we can get the other person on stage. It's like magic. I can't control this. It's just like going on in the background. We should be in the virtual world like Second Life, Tracy. I used to remember doing that. And that was
Animal Crossing. You can do meetings in Animal
exactly.
Crossing.
That was way ahead.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not quite here. I was told they were here, but they're not quite here. Those of you that are following, if you have questions for any of our panel or observations, please drop it into the chat. You were busy chatting earlier. I know you've been busy listening. But please drop it into the chat. I just wanted to share really briefly a couple of B Corps who I think are right on the money. One is Oddbox, which I know Virgin has talked about as well. So they've had a really exciting pandemic sort of period because they are taking wonky fruit and vegetables and turning them into a food delivery service. And for 3 years, Deepak and Emily, who started Oddbox, were like fighting and scrapping, and they were like making no money. And then, of course, this year, delivery services have gone through the roof, alongside with a trend and awareness around waste food. And the combination of the two has meant that Oddbox is suddenly there. So it's really exciting to see them explode. And of course, Pip and Nut, we're all big fans of when we're at home trying to enjoy ourselves a little bit more. I'm just going to see if Andy has got our guest ready or not, and if not to worry, we'll crack on because I've even got another 20 questions here for you guys. So we'll crack on for now. In terms of the environmental crises that this world is facing, that we're facing, how do you help? How do you as individuals, but also how do you help people in your community deal with that? We mentioned resilience briefly earlier, but how do you help people deal with that sort of feeling of like, we're tiny, the problems are huge? Because I often feel like this. I'm just like each day trying to move forward a little bit, but we're connected to these global problems, which we weren't 50 years ago. How do you? What's your mindset towards that on a day-to-day basis, and how do you help people?
Yeah, I think that's tough, really tough for people who feel like this and can recognize this as the existential crisis that it is, but sometimes feel powerless as to what their contribution ought to be. I think it starts with remembering that we're all individuals. We've all got individual responsibility and agency over our actions. But then also, just as the business develops and grows, is to continually be conscious over where you do have an impact and where you do have where you build relationships with suppliers, for example. Over time, can you encourage your suppliers to source more sustainably? Can you source more sustainably through other partners? One of the big things I would say for startups is speak to other startups. One of the benefits that we see in our community is that, it's very hard to leverage change on your own, but when you kind of band together and are able to try to leverage opportunities as a collective, whether that's sourcing from the same place that allows the kind of the costs to work out. I think all those things are things that we should be just keeping at the forefront of our minds and asking new decisions that we make. Is there a way we can do this more sustainably? Because it's sorry to jump in, Bruce, but that is almost an anti-business way of operating, isn't it? Because it's like, no, that's competition, that's competition, that's competition. If I collaborate, if I open up, if I share my how we do it kit, then they're just going to take it. And that's if we're honest, that's the fear that a lot of entrepreneurs and people running organizations have, right? Yeah, and it's total misnomer, really, because the most successful entrepreneurs and companies I know relentlessly collaborate. And it's not about saying that you collaborate in areas where it's directly in a conflict, but in areas where it's not, is that if you're truly mission driven, then it makes it much easier to collaborate. And you don't need to collaborate with direct competitors either. But this idea that anyone does it alone is just a bit ludicrous, really. We all know, because none of us have ever achieved anything really on our own. It's been someone else has supported us, advised us, helped us, whether that's friends, family, whoever it might be, colleagues, business advisors. We all get there when we support each other. And I think that's the really important thing, is that actually, if we collaborate more with each other, we communicate more with each other, we'll get to the shared mission much, much faster. Yeah.
Have faith, be more human about it. Great answer. James.
Just wanted to chime in and just agree with Bruce on the idea of finding your community in, like, I think it's the glocal, right? People are talking about the glocal. So, like, 2 examples of this, and 2 examples of the way in which companies are operating on this collaboration rather than competition model. So one of which is Finisterre. We recently ran a environmental kind of collective space, and that was very locally in the UK, in London. And they came with their kind of new water-soluble polythene bag like packaging, completely non-toxic, and they kind of held it up and say, it's called Leave No Trace. And they said, we all want you to use this. This isn't our USP, of this like overcoming the sustainable packaging challenge. We want you all to use this. So please use this. And the second point is being part of in a local network, but part of a global community. So I think over 500 B Corps announced at COP25 their intention to go carbon neutral by at least 2030, if not sooner. And so I think those 2 things are really important, because it gives you that kind of personal idea of being close to another business, but then it also gives you the idea of being greater than the sum of your parts and actually having a global solution to a global challenge.
Definitely. And Tracy, in terms of the 3 worlds that you mentioned at the start of this conversation, where are you seeing out of this world? So we're talking about Earth, virtual, and you've talked about virtual. What about off this planet? What's happening? And if you're an individual entrepreneur with a small loan, can you get involved with an off this planet idea?
Well, you want to get into something that's to do with some auxiliary or ancillary industry around small satellites, don't you? Because that is absolutely exploding now. But small companies that aren't small anymore, like Planet Labs or whatever, started off small with these big ambitions. And I guess that's one of the things I was thinking about when you asked the last question. Yes, it can feel too intimidating and a bit worrying, but not everything is a crisis all the time, and we have to get some perspective. And I think if we can start to think much more long term, because we always underestimate long-term effects and overestimate short-term effects. So if we can extend the vision out to the long term, we will get to a place where we start to think about what's the world we want to create in 20 or 30 whatever years time, and then use that vision to dictate what the 2 or 3 most important actions are that we're going to take in the next 12 to 18 months. And so it's this long-term vision and the short-term vision working together, sort of toggling together. So I'd say to any business, forget your 5-year plan, because that's not helpful. It's kind of too far out and not far out enough. Forget it, because it's not that helpful. Have a 30-year vision that dictates the actions you take in the next, 6 to 12 or 12 to 18 months, and that will give you some kind of perspective.
Tracy, you've just explained my favorite kind of mantra for work and life in a much more intellectual way than I could, which is keep your head in the clouds but your feet on the ground. So it's this idea that every day you dream, every day you think about the big future. You think about, if you're lying on your deathbed, what decisions would you make today on how to do differently? But keeping your feet on the ground, every day you act, every day you do something that's in line with your values, but it's moving things forward, and you forget the middle ground because it's messy. Like we've all done those forecasts, haven't we? Virgin StartUp's really good. They only make you forecast a little bit into the future, 18 months, but you do these 5-year business plans because some investor wants to have a look. It's like, it's bullshit because you don't know.
It's useless.
You don't know.
Useless. That's the problem. I mean, you can spend a lot of time doing that if you want to, but you won't probably.
But the funny thing about that is that you know it's not right. The people reading it know that it's not right, and so it's just an exercise for, I don't know, for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Yes,
So how do you do your business plans, Bruce?
So I mean, we think in the long term. So I think about we think in terms of like, what if we were able to affect the whole global economy? We think in that kind of lens, because it makes, exactly as you say, it makes us think about like what interventions we actually are able to do at this stage. It makes us think, are we working towards the big change? And I guess for me is like, startups is not, it's the literal opposite of get rich quick. So you better like what you're doing, and you better care about a kind of long-term objective, because it's unlikely to make you lots of money really quickly. And so you need to have a bigger buy-in. You need to care about a much bigger thing than just like, dream about what would the world look like if we were successful. And that's the thing that keeps me going on days like, days where it's just, particularly during this pandemic, which have been really exhausting. And sometimes you question, is that the right thing to have done today? Are we making enough progress as quickly as we'd like? And then you need to think, well, actually, we're working towards a big long-term change, not just a short-term trend or a blip. And that's the thing about purpose and impact that I'm, really conscious of. I think last year it became much more mainstream, but I'm really conscious that it doesn't just become a trend, that then next year we're interested in something new again, and we start to let this go. We need to be embedding this as part of the everyday, the normal, rather than an exception to the rule.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I think it's time we're going to switch over to our sessions, because we have a fantastic crew waiting in there to chat to the 150 members that have been following this conversation over the last 45 minutes. But Tracy, James, and Bruce, thank you so much for like tackling some of those big ideas bravely, but also sensitively to what people are trying to do, and some great examples which we've noted and shared with everyone. So thank you, and we'll everyone who's come tonight will have connections to what you're doing.